They thought it was just another routine stop. It was another simple goal. He placed his CIA badge on the table and the room was silent. Malik Bishop checked the time, 9:47 p.m. There was only 20 minutes between him and his house. The past 3 days have been blurred of 2 consecutive meetings in Dallas, several hours of negotiations, and a flight with cockroaches that hurt his bones. He loosened his tie as he led the black Lexus on an almost empty highway, and the engine total held the only noise the company had held. After that, red and blue lights will flash backwards. A sigh left his lips, and he slowly pulled him over his shoulder. He knew about movement. The hands were visible. There was no sudden movement. The window tumbled down before reaching it. A uniformed officer approached the driver's side, and a flashlight pointed directly in his face. Another person stood right behind him and placed his hand on his holster. "Evening, sir. License and registration," the officer said. Malik reached into his wallet and moved intentionally. "Are there any issues, officers?" "Broken back light." Malik's brewing broke together. That was impossible. His car had just been repaired prior to his trip. "Are you serious?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. The policeman's gaze became stiff. "Get out of the car." Malik breathed through his nose, already feeling where this was heading. But it was not an option that did not reject the option. He opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk. The night air was marked by asphalt and gasoline. His suit was the cold steel of a prepared police car, ready and ready. "They seem a little nervous," the second officer said, circling him like a predator. "What should we know?" Malik had no convulsions. "I'm just tired. I'm going home." The first officer sniffed into the air. "What does it smell like?" "It smells like marijuana." Malik laughed without humor. "That's not possible." The officer leaned forward, and his voice fell into a shocking tone. "Can we understand when we see your car?" This was the moment. When he refuses, they claim that he hid something. If he agrees, you will find a reason to justify what you want. Either way, the script was already written. "Please continue," Malik said brilliantly. They ran through his car, threw paper aside, and turned on his briefcase. The second officer pulled out a small prescription bottle. "What is that?" "Blood pressure medication." "It looks suspicious." A few minutes later, his hands were tied up before escalating. Inhibition. Resist. His mind remained calm when she thrust him into the back of the police car. Not because he wasn't angry, but because anger doesn't serve him here. Nevertheless, they had no idea who had just arrested. The trip to the train station was silent, separate from the radio police crackling. Malik sat in the back seat, his hands tied, his eyes still steady. He didn't ask questions. He did not protest. He knew that wasn't the problem. In the district, they led him through processing, as if it were a normal criminal. Fingerprints, marked personal objects. The fluorescence glowed over them, diminishing violently informal shadows on the walls of postural cells. The man in a hoodie was on the bench opposite him, and his eyes were half surprised. Another person went to the corner and muttered. The air was thick with sweat. Something old, such as old coffee and excuses, was getting old. Malik sat down and turned his back on the cool concrete. He folded his hands together, the impression of the cuffs still shaped onto his wrists. Time has passed. No one came for him. Then a heavy step. The door hummed. "Bishop." The same 2 policemen from the station were satisfied in front of the bar. Initially, he held the clipboard and tapped lazy against his palm. "Hard night. Is that so?" Malik said nothing. The second policeman laughed. "You could do that. Tell us what you really did tonight." Malik let out a slow breath. "Please come home from work." The police leaned against the extreme. "They go to explain to someone we were looking for. They had to hide something, so they came out of the car. Malik tilted his head. You told me so I came out. With attitude? I didn't know that this was counted as an attitude. The grin drew only a moment. Listen, the first officer cuts and shoves the side into the clipboard. Disability will be subject to strong fines for a while, but even if you cooperate, you can reduce it if you admit that you are against resistance. Confession. They wanted something that would make the paperwork easier. Malik made eye contact one after another. I'll wait for the lawyer. Please be silent. The atmosphere has changed. The first mate clicked his tongue and then knocked the pole twice. Adjust yourself. When they started going, Malik spoke again. Do you want to go through that? The second officer laughed. That's true. Why? Malik went to his knees. Because if you bring this to court, you're ready for what's coming next. The smile has returned this time. We don't worry about that. You should have been. But they couldn't see it until it was too late. 2 weeks later, Malik sat on a hard wooden chair, his fingers under his chin. The court smelled old books, a soothing oak filled with gentle rustlings of paperwork and the occasional mix of Jew apprentices adapted at the seats. On his other side, the two officers were confidently sitting in witness positions. They had already done this and had given them a certificate of brightness type that only comes from experience. The prosecutor, a lean man with a sharp suit and sharp tongue, went up and down in front of the Jew judge. Officer Daniels, can you guide us into what happened that night? The first officer cleaned his throat and sat straight. Yes, sir. We observed how the defendant drove irregularly, and when we stopped him, he noticed signs of nervous behavior. His hands tremble, and he hesitated by making eye contact when asked to leave the car. Malik did not flash. The prosecutor nodded. And was there any reason to assume he was affected? Absolutely, said the language company executive. A noticeable smell came out of the car, and when we asked him to intervene, it became known. Uncooperative? Malik almost laughed. He refused to search. He spoke up and resisted as we tried to catch him. They lied to lie, stacked up like decent bricks on a wall. The Jew apprentice looked carefully. Some took notes. Others may have studied Malik and looked for attacks they have just heard of. Next, the second officer said, the suspect was visibly excited. Malik remained silent, and his heart beat steadily. The judge, an elderly man with salt and pepper hair, turned his attention to the defense table. Is there anything to say before we continue? Malik smiled for the first time this morning. He reached out, finished his briefcase, and pulled out his slim black ID card. He then placed it on the table without words. The prosecutor frowned, taking a step forward. The judge said, Mr. Bishop. Malik leaned forward, his voice calming down. Counterintelligence Division, CIA. The silence fell on the room like a drained hammer. The officers are scared. The prosecutor's mouth opened and closed. The GU judge suddenly saw the case from a completely different perspective. And this is exactly the story of the officials beginning to collapse with caution. The prosecutor blinks, and he can see his confidence. He saw the judge and then returned to Malik. Counterintelligence? It has recovered as if it had somehow changed its meaning, as if it were pronounced loudly in some way. Malik nodded. That's right. The two officers suddenly looked confident and as if they had swallowed glass. The second Reynolds was transformed into his seat. The judge leaned forward. Bishop, do you think you're a representative for the Central Intelligence Agency? I couldn't find it, Malik said. I checked that. Reynolds breathed in and looked at Daniels. However, the tension in his shoulder pulled him away. Jew's judge noticed. The prosecutor pushed his hand into his mouth, and his tranquility slipped. Your honor, if possible. Can't. The judge changed the views of the witnesses. His sound was no longer patient and sharp. Officer Daniels, Officer Reynolds, would you like to change some of your previous certificate? Daniels breathed through his nose. His fingers grabbed the armrest of the chair. I don't think you have any honor. No. Malik finally spoke again, his voice smooth as glass. He leaned forward. Then help you remember. You said I looked nervous, but I negotiate with everyday polygraph tests, high commitment, and field reviews that can break down most men. Do you think this court believes I have rocked the routine traffic stops? Reynolds swallowed. You said I smelled marijuana, but I have the approval worth having to pass the country's most stringent drug tests. Why should I abandon a jointly and accurately built career? Daniels looked straight, and his Adam's apple grew. Malik is not complete. He turned to the Jew degree. These men have been pinning the fact that there'll be another case number where I don't have the resources to protect myself, but they've made a mistake. Please be silent. Difficult. We cannot reconcile. The judge overturns the prosecutor. Does the nation want to advance? The prosecutor hesitated. Malik was able to see the war in his head. Move forward, risking how it looks like a fool or a backpedal, saving how little reliability is. Your Honor, he finally said in a voice. The state will move to dismiss the accusation. It's just finished. But the nightmare only began for executives Daniels and Reynolds. Daniels and Reynolds sat frozen as the reality of the moment settled on them. What started as a routine setup was a disaster in real time at the end of my career and became very bad. The judge wore glasses and with a long-awaited expression on his neutrality. Before I share a state application for termination, I have a question, he said, his voice wearing the weight of the room. Official, do you want to explain why you misrepresented the facts of this incident? Reynolds moved uncomfortably. Daniels took a sharp breath. Neither of them spoke. Do you have anything to say? I asked the judge. And then please forgive me. He turned to the store clerk. We'll send you an inquiry to internal matters. This issue requires immediate review. The prosecutor closed his briefcase. He didn't even bother to meet the officers. He knew what was coming. Daniel's face turned pale. Your Honor, us? You'll be silent, the judge cuts, and his tone is now ice. It was your turn to speak. Reynolds rubbed his hands against his thighs, and his nerves finally revealed him. Malik leaned against his chair and looked. He could now see it in their faces as soon as he realized that their authority was no longer a sign. The Jew judges were on the way. The once attentive enforcement officer saw how to do it with officials. And Malik? He wasn't enough. He placed his hands on the table, his voice tensed. We would like to officially request an investigation into all traffic stops over the past 5 years. There is a reason to assume this is not an isolated incident. Reynolds' head squealed. You can't do that. Malik smiled. You can actually do it. Daniels looked to the prosecutor and asked for help, but the man had already stuffed it together. He had no intention of syncing with them. The judges have grown. The request will be granted. And like that, her entire house of lies came together. But the worst has come. 2 weeks later, Malik was sitting in his office. There's a big file in front of him. Records of reports, complaints, patterns. Daniels and Reynolds were not just bad police officers. They were predators with badges. The trial found dozens of cases and his cases, false halts, invented accusations, blackmail tactics. Some of the victims had lost their jobs. Others have lost for years to a system that never gave them a significant opportunity. Now it's all revealed. Daniels had resigned before he was officially fired. Reynolds tried to fight back, but an internal assessment found him guilty of several violations, including forging police reports. His badge retreated from his colleagues. Malik had seen a man like her before. They were carefree, and thought they would never have any consequences. But the power of non-accountability was nothing more than corruption. I knocked on the door and pulled him out of his thoughts. His lawyer entered a folder on his desk and dropped it. "Official of settlement from the city," she said. "They want them to complain." Malik didn't touch it. "Would you take it?" she asked. He thought that someone in uniform never got the justice they could not afford to buy a lawyer who sat in a cell, simply because they had decided that their life was not worth the truth. Malik exhaled. "No." His lawyer raised an eyebrow. "I don't want your money," he said. "I want political change. I want to fix the training. I want to close these gaps so that no one else has to go through what I've done." She studied him for a while, then nodded. "I'll make some calls." Malik has returned to the case file. He wasn't enough. It's not a long shot. Justice only works when truth has a voice. Some people arm their authority, rely on silence, knowing that the system protects them. But this system is only as strong as an accountable person. Malik had the resources to protect himself. Many aren't. For this reason, we must ask ourselves questions, demand transparency, and encourage real change. Because the truth does not bend to power, it reveals it. If this story is addressing you, you are not silent. Share this video, leave a comment, reveal changes, and subscribe to other stories that inspire you. Because consciousness is the first step towards justice.